Senator John Kennedy was famous for his Louisiana Southern gentleman style and mocking wit. He thought his patronizing joke directed at young Jasmine Crockett would make him look clever and experienced. But the Harvard law graduate's response would expose the real ignorance beneath his fake Southern accent and condescending attitude. Kennedy would learn that day that mocking some people could end his career. The Hart Senate Office Building's Committee Room 216 was bathed in the golden afternoon light of a Washington October, casting long shadows across the mahogany panels that had witnessed decades of congressional theater. The Senate Judiciary Committee was in session for what had been scheduled as routine oversight hearings on federal judicial nominations, but the tension in the room suggested that nothing about this day would be routine. At the center of the curved dais sat Senator John Neely Kennedy of Louisiana, his trademark suspenders visible beneath his navy suit jacket, his silver hair perfectly styled in the kind of careful casual arrangement that television producers loved. At 72 years old, Kennedy had cultivated an image as the folksy voice of common sense in an increasingly polarized Senate, delivering sound bites in his thick Louisiana drawl that regularly went viral on social media and earned him frequent invitations to cable news shows. Kennedy's political persona was carefully crafted theater. The heavy accent, the folksy aphorisms, the "ah shucks" delivery that made him sound like he'd just stepped off a fishing boat in Baton Rouge. It was all designed to project authenticity in an era when voters craved genuine voices. What his admirers didn't know, and what his political opponents had never been able to effectively expose, was how calculated every element of his public image really was. 3 rows behind the senators, in the section reserved for House members attending the hearing, sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. She had requested permission to observe the proceedings as part of her work on the House Judiciary Committee, where similar nomination issues fell under her purview. Her presence had been noted by several senator staff members, though none could determine exactly why a second-term House member from Texas would spend her afternoon watching Senate proceedings. What they didn't know was that Crockett had come to the hearing with a very specific purpose. For the past 6 weeks, her office had been conducting what could only be described as an archaeological dig into Kennedy's political and personal history. Using her legal background and a small team of researchers, she had uncovered information that painted a very different picture of the Louisiana senator than the one he presented to the world. The hearing itself had proceeded predictably for the first 2 hours. Judicial nominees were questioned about their qualifications, their judicial philosophies, and their views on constitutional interpretation. Kennedy had performed his usual role as the committee's entertainment, delivering quotable one-liners and homespun wisdom that would likely be featured on evening news programs across the country. But the atmosphere shifted when the committee moved to general questioning about the broader state of the federal judiciary and the confirmation process. It was during this portion of the hearing that Kennedy spotted an opportunity for what he believed would be another viral moment, at the expense of the young congresswoman sitting in the observer section. "You know," Kennedy began, his voice carrying the lazy cadence that had made him a cable news favorite, "it's always interesting to see our young colleagues from the House taking such a keen interest in Senate proceedings." His eyes fixed directly on Crockett as he continued, "I suppose when you're still learning the ropes of government service, it's educational to watch how the more experienced chamber handles serious business." The comment drew chuckles from several Republican senators and knowing smiles from their staff members. It was classic Kennedy, a joke that appeared good-natured on the surface while delivering a cutting message about experience and competence. The implication was clear. The Senate was where the real work of government was done, while the House was a kind of training ground for junior politicians. Kennedy wasn't finished. "I'm reminded of something my grandfather used to say back in Zachary, Louisiana. Son, you got to learn to walk before you can run, and you got to learn to listen before you got something worth saying." Might be some wisdom there for our younger colleagues who think they understand complex constitutional issues after serving a term or 2 in the House. The patronizing tone was unmistakable. and several observers noted that Kennedy's accent seemed to have grown thicker as he delivered his folksy put-down. This was political theater at its most calculated, using the guise of Southern hospitality to deliver an insult wrapped in homespun wisdom. But what Kennedy hadn't anticipated was that Jasmine Crockett would be given an opportunity to respond. Committee Chairman Dick Durbin, perhaps sensing that Kennedy had crossed a line from harmless banter into something more problematic, made an unusual decision. "I notice we have Congresswoman Crockett observing our proceedings today," Durbin said diplomatically. "Since Senator Kennedy has referenced the House's interest in judicial matters, perhaps the Congresswoman would like to share her perspective on the nomination process from the House Judiciary Committee's viewpoint." It was an unprecedented courtesy, allowing a House member to address a Senate committee during formal proceedings. But Durbin's long experience had taught him that sometimes the best way to defuse tension was to address it directly rather than let it simmer beneath the surface. Kennedy's confident smirk suggested he welcomed the opportunity. He had just delivered what he believed was a masterful put-down, and he expected any response from the young Congresswoman to be defensive, possibly emotional, and ultimately ineffective. He had made a career out of using his folksy charm to disarm opponents, and he saw no reason why this situation would be different. Crockett rose from her seat with the composed grace that had served her well during her legal career. When she spoke, her voice carried none of the defensiveness that Kennedy had expected. Instead, it carried the precise, measured tone of someone who had spent considerable time preparing for exactly this moment. "Thank you, Chairman Durbin, and thank you, Senator Kennedy, for your colorful observations about experience and wisdom." Her slight pause before colorful drew knowing smiles from several Democratic senators who recognized the diplomatic language of political combat. "You're absolutely right that experience matters in government service," she continued, her tone remaining conversational despite the tension in the room. "Which is why I was so interested in reviewing your own experience and background in preparation for today's hearing." Kennedy's expression shifted slightly. The mention of reviewing his background suggested this wasn't going to be the defensive response he had anticipated. "For instance," Crockett continued, pulling out a leather portfolio that several observers noted was considerably thicker than typical hearing materials, "I was fascinated to learn about your educational background. Harvard Law School, Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar, University of Virginia for your undergraduate degree. Quite impressive credentials for someone who presents himself as a simple country lawyer." The observation was delivered without malice, but its implications were devastating. Kennedy had built his political brand on being an authentic voice of rural Louisiana, a man of the people who understood common sense better than coastal elites. The revelation of his Ivy League credentials, delivered in front of cameras and a room full of political observers, began to expose the carefully constructed nature of his public persona. But Crockett was just getting started. "I was particularly intrigued by your time at Oxford, where you studied civil law and wrote your thesis on constitutional interpretation in federal systems, a comparative analysis of American and British legal traditions. Fascinating work on complex constitutional issues, actually." The academic language was a stark contrast to Kennedy's folksy delivery style, and the irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Here was a man who regularly dismissed complex constitutional analysis as overly intellectual when it suited his political purposes, but who had actually spent years engaged in exactly that kind of sophisticated legal scholarship. Kennedy attempted to regain control of the exchange. "Well now, Congresswoman, I appreciate you doing your homework, but I'm not sure what point you're trying to make. A man can get a good education and still remember where he comes from." "Oh, absolutely, Senator," Crockett agreed, her tone remaining pleasant even as she prepared to detonate what political observers would later describe as a credibility nuclear weapon. "Which is why I was so curious about where you actually came from." She opened her portfolio and pulled out what appeared to be a detailed genealogical analysis. "You see, You've built much of your political image on being authentic Louisiana voice, a man whose roots run deep in bayou country. Your campaign materials regularly reference your grandfather's simple wisdom from Zachary, Louisiana, and your connection to the working people of your state. Kennedy's confidence was beginning to waver. The level of research Crockett was demonstrating suggested this wasn't a casual inquiry, but a comprehensive investigation that might uncover information he preferred to keep private. But here's what I found interesting, Crockett continued, her voice taking on the precise tone she had used during her most devastating cross-examinations as a civil rights attorney. Your family moved to Louisiana when you were 16 years old. Before that, you spent your childhood in Mississippi and Tennessee, primarily in affluent suburban communities. Your grandfather, the source of all that folksy wisdom you regularly quote, was actually a successful insurance executive in Memphis who sent you to an exclusive private boarding school in Connecticut for your final 2 years of high school. The revelation was politically devastating. Kennedy's entire brand was built on authentic Louisiana roots and working-class wisdom passed down through generations. The reality of a privileged upbringing in suburban Memphis, followed by Connecticut prep school, Oxford, and Harvard, painted a very different picture. But Crockett wasn't finished with her deconstruction of Kennedy's carefully crafted image. In fact, she continued, pulling out another document, I have a copy of your application essay to Harvard Law School, written in 1973. It's quite eloquent, sophisticated vocabulary, complex sentence structure. Not a trace of the Louisiana dialect that has become your trademark. She looked directly at Kennedy, her expression remaining professional despite the devastating nature of her revelation. The accent senator appears to be a relatively recent addition to your public speaking style. Video footage from your early legal career shows standard American English with no regional inflection. The implications were staggering. Kennedy hadn't just exaggerated his Louisiana roots. He had apparently invented an entire persona, complete with a fake accent and fabricated family folklore, to appeal to voters who valued authenticity over credentials. Several senators on both sides of the aisle shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They were witnessing the systematic destruction of a colleague's public image in real time, and the thoroughness of the research suggested that this wasn't a spontaneous response, but a carefully planned operation. Kennedy made a desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Now hold on just a minute, Congresswoman. A man's speaking style can evolve over time, and just because I got a good education doesn't mean I've forgotten my roots or lost touch with regular folks. You're absolutely right about not losing touch with regular folks, Crockett replied, her tone becoming noticeably sharper. Which is why I was so surprised to discover how you've actually voted on issues affecting the regular folks of Louisiana. She pulled out what appeared to be a comprehensive voting analysis, and Kennedy visibly flinched. If she had this level of detailed information about his background, what else might she have discovered? Let's talk about Hurricane Katrina relief, Crockett began, her voice now carrying unmistakable authority. You regularly reference the resilience and strength of Louisiana people in your speeches, particularly their recovery from natural disasters. But when the Gulf Coast Hurricane Housing Recovery Act came up for a vote in 2019, legislation that would have provided crucial housing assistance to families still recovering from Katrina and subsequent storms, you voted against it. When the Flood Insurance Reform Act was proposed to make flood insurance more affordable for Louisiana homeowners, you opposed it. When federal funding was allocated for levee improvements and coastal restoration projects that could protect your state from future hurricanes, you consistently voted to reduce or eliminate that funding. Each vote she cited painted a picture of a senator who used Louisiana struggles for political theater, while consistently voting against measures that would actually help his constituents. The contrast between his public image as a champion of Louisiana values and his actual legislative record was becoming impossible to ignore. But here's what I found most interesting, Crockett continued, pulling out another section of her analysis. While you were voting against disaster relief for Louisiana families, you were supporting tax breaks for wealthy individuals and corporations that overwhelmingly benefit people in your previous income bracket. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which provided minimal benefits to working families while offering substantial advantages to high earners. You enthusiastically supported it. Estate tax reductions that only affect the wealthiest Americans. You've consistently advocated for them. Corporate tax loopholes that allow large companies to avoid paying their fair share. You've defended them as necessary for economic growth. The systematic presentation was devastating. Kennedy had built his political brand on being a voice for working-class Louisiana, but his voting record suggested someone whose priorities aligned much more closely with his actual background as a privileged, highly educated member of the elite. Chairman Durbin, sensing that the exchange had moved far beyond normal hearing procedures, attempted to intervene. Perhaps we should return to our scheduled questioning of nominees. Actually, Mr. Chairman, I think this is quite relevant to our discussion of judicial nominations, Crockett interrupted smoothly, because Senator Kennedy's comments about experience and wisdom in constitutional interpretation raise important questions about authenticity in public service. She turned back to Kennedy, her voice now carrying prosecutorial precision. Senator, you've built your career on presenting yourself as a plain-spoken representative of Louisiana values, someone who cuts through Washington complexity with common-sense wisdom. But your actual background suggests something very different. You're a Rhodes Scholar with a law degree from Harvard who constructed an entire fake persona, complete with an invented accent and fabricated family stories, to appeal to voters who you apparently believed would be attracted to anti-intellectual populism. The question isn't whether you're qualified to serve in the Senate. Your educational credentials clearly demonstrate that you are. The question is whether you respect your constituents enough to be honest with them about who you actually are. The accusation of fundamental dishonesty with voters was perhaps the most serious charge that could be leveled against an elected official. It suggested not just political calculation, but a deep contempt for the democratic process itself. Kennedy's response was telling. Instead of denial or defensiveness, he seemed to deflate, as if recognizing that his carefully constructed persona had been irreparably damaged. Congresswoman, I think you're mischaracterizing Am I? Crockett interrupted. Because I also have documentation of your real estate holdings, which paint an interesting picture of someone who claims to represent working-class Louisiana. She pulled out another document, and Kennedy looked like he might be physically ill. Your primary residence is a $2.3 million estate in Madisonville, Louisiana. Hardly a working-class neighborhood. Your second home in Washington is a $1.8 million Georgetown townhouse. You also own investment properties in 3 states with a combined value of over $5 million. Yet your campaign advertisements regularly feature you in pickup trucks and fishing boats, talking about understanding the struggles of ordinary Louisiana families who are worried about paying their bills. The contrast between Kennedy's wealth and his campaign image was stark. But Crockett wasn't finished exposing the gap between his public persona and private reality. Most tellingly, she continued, I have records showing that you employ a full-time dialect coach, someone who helps you maintain the Louisiana accent that apparently doesn't come naturally after decades of Ivy League education and elite social circles. The revelation that Kennedy's signature accent was actually a performance, coached and maintained like an actor preparing for a role, was perhaps the most personally humiliating detail Crockett had shared. It suggested that every folksy aphorism, every piece of down-home wisdom, every "aw shucks" moment had been carefully rehearsed theater. The silence that followed was profound. Kennedy sat slumped in his chair, his carefully constructed political persona lying in ruins around him. Other senators stared at their papers, clearly uncomfortable with the systematic destruction they had just witnessed. But Crockett had one final revelation that would cement Kennedy's political fate. However, What I found most troubling wasn't the fake accent or the invented persona, she said, her voice taking on a tone of genuine moral indignation. It was the pattern of votes that consistently helped wealthy interests while harming the very Louisiana families you claim to champion. She pulled out a final document that appeared to be a comprehensive analysis of Kennedy's voting record cross-referenced with campaign contributions. Over the past 6 years, your voting patterns have aligned with the interests of your largest corporate donors 89% of the time, while aligning with the preferences of Louisiana voters, as measured by polling on specific issues, only 34% of the time. The numbers were politically toxic. An 89% alignment with corporate donors versus 34% with actual constituents suggested a fundamental betrayal of representative democracy. You've used your fake persona to win elections while consistently voting against the interests of the people who elected you. That's not just political theater, Senator. That's fraud. The word fraud hung in the air like an accusation at a criminal trial. Every person in the room understood that they had witnessed something unprecedented, a complete and systematic destruction of a senator's credibility, delivered with legal precision and backed by comprehensive documentation. Kennedy made one final, desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of his reputation. Congresswoman, I think you've taken a lot of information out of context and dash. Actually, Senator, Crockett interrupted, everything I've shared today is fully documented and available for verification. The real question is why someone would create such an elaborate deception to win elections, and what that says about their respect for the democratic process. She closed her portfolio and looked directly at Kennedy with something approaching pity. You asked about experience and wisdom in government service. Well, here's some wisdom from my grandfather, the real one, who actually did grow up poor in East Texas. If you have to lie about who you are to get people to vote for you, maybe you shouldn't be asking for their votes. The devastating simplicity of the statement, delivered in Crockett's natural speaking voice without any artificial folksy inflection, provided a stark contrast to Kennedy's manufactured persona. It was authentic wisdom delivered authentically, which made Kennedy's calculated performance appear even more false by comparison. What happened next would be analyzed by political scientists for years to come. Kennedy, faced with the complete exposure of his fraudulent public image, did something almost unprecedented in modern politics. He apologized. "You're right," he said quietly, his voice now carrying what observers would note was his first authentic emotion of the day. "I created a persona that I thought would connect with voters, and somewhere along the way, I lost track of who I actually was and what I actually believed. The people of Louisiana deserve better than someone who lies to them about something as basic as his own identity and background. They deserve representation that's based on honest convictions, not focus group-tested performance." The apology was remarkable not just for its rarity in modern politics, but for its apparent sincerity. Kennedy seemed genuinely shaken by the systematic exposure of his deception, as if seeing his behavior clearly for the first time. Chairman Durbin, recognizing that the hearing had moved far beyond its original purpose, but understanding the historical significance of what had just occurred, made a decision that would be studied in political science classes for decades. "I think," he said slowly, "that this exchange has provided a valuable lesson about the importance of authenticity in public service. The American people deserve representatives who are honest about who they are and what they believe." He turned to Kennedy with something approaching sympathy. "Senator, I hope you'll take some time to consider what kind of public servant you want to be going forward." In the days following what became known as the Kennedy exposure, the political fallout was swift and comprehensive. Video clips of the exchange went viral across social media platforms, with particular attention paid to the revelation about the dialect coach and the fabricated family stories. Late-night comedians had a field day with the material, but the mockery was tempered by genuine discussion about authenticity in politics and the responsibility of elected officials to their constituents. Louisiana newspapers began their own investigations into Kennedy's background and voting record, confirming many of Crockett's revelations and uncovering additional details about the gap between his public image and private reality. Editorial boards across the state called for his resignation, arguing that his fundamental deception of voters made his continued service untenable. Perhaps most damaging was the response from Louisiana voters themselves. Town halls in his home state became confrontational affairs where constituents demanded explanations for both his deceptive persona and his voting record. The folksy charm that had once made him beloved became a source of anger and betrayal among people who felt they had been deliberately misled. 3 weeks after the hearing, Kennedy announced that he would not seek re-election, citing a desire to step back and reflect on how I can better serve the people of Louisiana in ways that don't require holding elected office. Political insiders understood that his career in electoral politics was effectively over. The damage to his credibility was too comprehensive to overcome. For Jasmine Crockett, the confrontation established her as one of the Democratic Party's most formidable voices for accountability and authenticity. Her methodical approach to exposing political deception, combined with her legal precision and moral authority, made her a frequent choice for high-profile hearings and media appearances. More importantly, her demonstration that comprehensive research and factual accuracy could overcome even the most carefully constructed political personas provided a template for holding elected officials accountable. The Kennedy takedown became required viewing in journalism schools, political communication classes, and ethics courses. It demonstrated how thorough preparation and moral courage could expose even the most sophisticated political deceptions. It showed that in an era of manufactured authenticity and focus group-tested personas, genuine research and honest confrontation could still prevail. But perhaps the most important lesson was simpler. Voters deserve representatives who are honest about who they are, what they believe, and whom they actually serve. Kennedy's elaborate deception, the fake accent, invented stories, and manufactured persona, represented everything that was wrong with modern political theater. Jasmine Crockett, armed with nothing more than comprehensive research and unwavering commitment to truth, had shown that such deceptions could be exposed and that accountability was still possible in American politics. Her quiet competence and moral authority had triumphed over decades of political theater and manufactured charm. The image that became iconic from that day was Kennedy's shocked expression when he realized the extent of Crockett's research, contrasted with her calm professionalism as she methodically dismantled his carefully constructed facade. It captured not just the end of one political career, but the potential for a new era of authenticity in American politics. An era where voters would no longer have to wonder whether their representatives were telling the truth about something as basic as their own identity and background. An era where comprehensive research and moral courage would hold even the most skilled political performers accountable for their deceptions. The silence that had followed Kennedy's fake folksy wisdom became the sound of political authenticity, reclaiming its rightful place in American democracy. And when that silence was broken, it was broken by the voice of truth, preparation, and genuine public service. Years later, Kennedy would write in his memoirs about that October afternoon as the moment he realized that political success built on deception was ultimately hollow and unsustainable. He would credit Crockett with forcing him to confront the fundamental dishonesty that had defined his political career and express gratitude for being held accountable before the deception could cause even more harm to democratic discourse. But on that day, in that Senate committee room, it was simply a Harvard law graduate doing what lawyers do best: presenting evidence, exposing lies, and holding power accountable to truth. The fact that she did it with grace, precision, and unwavering commitment to authenticity made the moment not just a political victory, but a democratic triumph that would be remembered long after both participants had left public service.